Hello there, so this is going to be the very first video in an ongoing series where we're going to be looking at the archetypes, the fundamental substructures of the human psyche. And we're going to start that process today by looking at a rather wonderful archetype that's represented in the expression of the trickster. In these videos, we're going to look at the core elements of each archetype and also look at examples of where their patterns show up in our lived experiences. I want us to understand these phenomena conceptually, but also work through how they work their way into our lives so that we can recognize them and integrate them more intelligently. I want us to do this not only because it's interesting, but also because it will really help us to get a handle on the dynamics of the mind, and that might lead to a more enriching and healthy relationship with it. So, with all that being said, let's now look at the archetype of the trickster. Now, I tell you, it really wasn't an easy task selecting the first archetype for study, because I wanted an engaging one to start things off, obviously, and I also wanted to see if there was one that could open us up and branch out to the others and give it a kind of logical continuum. And then, unexpectedly, this one presented itself. And now I think about it, starting with the trickster archetype is actually a really brilliant one to begin with, because it made me realize that I was approaching this problem in the wrong way. Not by intent, but by method. And it was a sudden flash of random intuition that broke that prior pattern of thought down and led to this new one. And that pattern of action is completely in keeping with the archetype that we're going to discuss now. So maybe beginning from a place of chaotic instability is actually a far more reasonable place to begin this introduction than starting with a more robust archetype. And in its style, it's actually keeping with the mythological records whose beginnings usually begin in chaos. So now that we've got our basis covered with that, what can we really say about the trickster? The trickster represents the component within the psyche that overthrows systems. It is the unexpected vector that is always throwing curveballs into our best solutions, sometimes for the betterment or the calamity of those solutions. The trickster is a psychic embodiment of the spontaneous and creative ability that alters established systems and sets the ground for new patterns of growth. On our deepest anatomical level, we could say that this archetype embodies that part of the brain's strategy to generate new vectors of thought that undermine and alter the dynamics of its own models of the world. It's part of the brain's capacity to overthrow its own navigational circuits for the potential creation of new circuits that will build up on the models that are outdated and are no longer working within our current life situation. Old systems, like habits, die hard, and often all that's needed is a spontaneous burst of the unexpected to unravel those systems apart. Nervous breakdowns, violent revolutions, eureka moments of invention, and that 11th hour of rescue are all examples of this sudden, explosive, and unexpected circumstance to dramatically alter the trajectory of our living patterns. And when we really look at them, the ways that this chaos component manifests itself are endless. The subversive creativity of the human brain to undermine its own thought patterns might have been the leading cause of why we have evolved in such a dramatic direction from our animal brethren. It has been the eternally renewing agent that has produced all of our worth, and yet, at the same time, maybe the leading cause for our own undoing. Alright then, now let's talk about chaos for a bit, because this, I think, is the essential effect that the trickster archetype brings with it. We have to be careful not to allow our minds to fly off into logical extremes when we hear words like chaos and destruction, because when we conceptualize these things mythologically and within our own life experiences, we come to a far more personal and nuanced understanding of them and see how we have been engaging with them all of our lives. You have played the trickster in many spontaneous situations that have produced unexpected results. Many of them you remember for how hilarious they were or how ingenious they were at the time. Others you might want to forget about because they led to a tragedy in your life. If you've ever been in a social situation where the ambience of the group dies down and you suddenly introduce the new vector of a joke that lifts people's spirits up and makes them all laugh, you've activated the trickster archetype, because when you think about it, a joke is a chaotic vector that acts spontaneously to shock people out of their habitual zones and makes them fall into a fit of spasmic laughter, which if we understand it through various ancient lenses, is actually a lapse into a kind of divine madness. The chaos component acts best through the unexpected, and it breaks you down to build you back up again into a new order. Let's consider another example. All of your biggest life decisions have resulted in the death of 1,000 old possibilities. The chaotic root of your action disintegrates more potentialities than it succeeds in building up. And you have fantasized about destruction. You've flirted with it, not only for certain external systems, but most of all for your own. You have been the thwarter and chaos creator of so many major life events, and you will continue to be so throughout your time, because you possess the same archetypal capacity for spontaneous influence wherever you go. And I want us to recognize the destructive and the creative components of chaos here, because this is the real energizing component of the trickster archetype, and for a great deal of our action as well. Chaos is usually awarded with this really negative connotation, isn't it? And sometimes that's appropriate because there's a tragic element to structures breaking down. But we also have to recognize that with this tragedy lies the seed that sets the stage for new forms of life that, for whatever reason, cannot find their footing within the prior systems. And that prior system has to be shaken up or shaken down in order for that new, younger life to flex itself and move properly in the world and take things forward. And all of this is really a fancy way of saying that prior systems have to break down in order for new systems to grow up from that bed of disintegration. And the chaos component is one of the instrumental factors, if not the instrumental factor, that determines that disintegration and that renewal. That's why chaos is both tragic and generative. It might seem like a bit of a contradiction when we look at these things on face value, yeah. But really it's a kind of synergy that exists between the conditions of destruction and creation. And often, old systems, like I said before, they don't budge easily. they can be very difficult to unwind if you take them head on at their own game. But with the introduction of unexpected variables, the system becomes unstable. And that instability is the wound window through which the new vectors of the future enter through. The trickster archetype has been rendered mythologically by various animal and human guises, and now we're going to look at some of the ways that it's been represented. In Native American mythology, the trickster is the hare, or in other myths, he is the coyote. In other myths from around the world, he is the raven, and he can also be the serpent. Notice how all of these animals are associated into this chaos. They're all very sharp, they're all very quick, and quite sneaky animals. And if you're out hunting for the hare, say, you can think that you've got the better of it, but as you reach out to grab it, it slips like liquid out of your hands and evades you. And I think it's very possible that human beings have been watching these animals for long periods of time and attributed their patterns of action directly onto the patterns of the archetypal substructure. It's not an arbitrary thing that these animals have been selected by the brain to embody these substructures, because in their own unique way, they all associate directly to the substructures that are circulating within the mind, and the brain harnesses them and embodies them symbolically. With mythological archetypes, we're talking about a kind of evolutionary skin language that's applied to the brain's substructures, and when it's associated successfully, we now possess a visual language to relate to those phenomenal patterns that we're noticing in our life in a way that's far more accessible and plausible. So now let's look at another mythological example of how this trickster manifests itself. In Norse mythology, we of course have the figure of Loki, who many more people know now thanks to the success of the Marvel movies. And in those movies, he's represented as being the brother of Thor, but in the original mythology, that isn't the case at all. Loki is partially the offspring of a giant, a frost giant to be specific. So he has that primordial capacity within him, which lends to his chaotic and chthonic qualities. Loki's a very multifarious character, as he would naturally be for a trickster, of course. And I must say that his more contemporary renderings of him haven't really brought this out as effectively as I would have liked. Still, with all that being said, he's still a very highly interesting figure due to his multiplicity and the lineage of patterns that he carries over into the world. And also his nihilism, this seeming disregard not only for his fellow gods, but also for the fate of the world itself. Loki is most well known for bringing about the death of the beloved Balder with a spear made of mistletoe. And he is, of course, naturally associated with those chthonic aspects of death and with skeletons and with the deep earth, probably due to its disintegrating agency. He can also, through his strange charms, grant access to boons that would otherwise be reserved exclusively for the gods. So he has this intermediary aspect between the gods and mankind, quite like Prometheus, who's also a trickster motif. And many people don't actually know that, but Prometheus is actually a trickster motif. And wherever Loki treads, he carries with him this great discord and an effect of unraveling positive systems, which doesn't do anything for his local popularity, of course, but it always plays into this synergy that I was talking about before, in this relationship between disharmony and creation, that within the shape of all action lies the form of its conflict. And Carl Jung himself actually spoke to this directly when he said, in all chaos there is a cosmos, in all disorder a secret order. Loki always reveals the dirty secret in the noblest of ideals. He exposes that speck of dirt on the wedding dress at the very last minute. He is the one who puts a stutter in the mouth of a man in the middle of a great speech. And by the same token, he can also find the positive in the negative, the sacred element in an act of decadence, for example, or an act of profanity. He sees the creativity composed within an act of destruction, as the anarchist Mikhail Bakunin stated, that I put up at the beginning of this. So there's this kind of hidden esoteric aspect to the Trickster in how he always brings about the hidden variable within complex patterns of action. Loki is also a shapeshifter. He is a god of metamorphosis and transformation. But the way that he goes about that transformation is through the contradiction and unwinding of those positive systems and the reshaping of those patterns into a new order that sets the stage for further continuations of growth down the line. He is the cultural transformant principle. He fosters the emergence of new systems through the death and the disharmony of other systems. And I think that these tricksters are so emblematic of the fact that within all styles and modes of human action, there lies the seed of a hidden agent that would transform them or catalyze them in unexpected ways. You can be going through what you think is a very positive course in your life, and then out of that very mode of action that's taking you there, it concludes to a very different destination than the one that you thought that you were heading to. And popular narratives and pop culture reveal these kind of tracks all the time. Chaos can bring about an order, and an order can bring about its own ruination. So then, there we have it. This has been the first video done in the Archetype 101 series covering the Trickster. I've really enjoyed making this video. It's been great to research and run over some of these old things again, and I think I've covered all of the major bases that I really wanted to articulate and put across to you concerning this archetype. If we can keep this level of standard going into the future, I think this video series is going to turn out really positive. Like I said, I've really enjoyed making this one. If you want to explore more about this archetype, there was more material that I was actually going to put in here, but for the sake of keeping this below the 20-minute mark, I decided to leave some things out. But have a look at some stuff concerning the Fool feature. The Fool aspect of the Trickster is very interesting if you want to find out more about him. Like I said, the Trickster is a very multifarious archetype, and this could have definitely been a much longer video, but I'd like to keep these within the kind of 20-minute bracket. Nonetheless, we've looked at it on multiple layers of resolution. We've looked at it on the mythological setting, of course. We've looked at it from a bit of a evolutionary psychology angle. We've looked at it also in some life experiential ways that this Trickster can manifest itself in as well, which is what I really wanted to do. I didn't simply want to give a simple, deliberation on this. I really wanted to look at it on different layers of resolution, because that's where they correspond at. And yeah, that's all I could really say on this video series for the moment. I hope that you've really enjoyed watching this as much as I have making it. And as usual, I'll see you again in the next one.